The first thing you're going to do for your poster design here is you're going to create a new document, right? So when we go to Photoshop, we say new. We have our settings over here. I'm going to change this to inches, right? So inches is what we want. We're going to make it 11 inches wide by 17 inches high. If you did want to make it 17 by 11 like a horizontal, you could, but we were just talking that most posters are vertical in nature for the most part. I mean, there's some specialty things, but when you see movie posters, you see all sorts of things, it's usually vertical. All right, resolution is 150 pixels per inch. Remember, we are not using vector graphics this time. We are using bitmap graphics. So we're talking about pixels here. So that means for every inch of space, there's 150 dots of color. The more dots of color, the higher the resolution, the better the picture looks. But you also have a huge, enormous file. So we're not going to put like 3,000 pixels per inch because your eye can't even perceive that really, and it's also just a waste of file space. So 11 by 17 by 150 should be fine for what we're doing right now. Background color, you can change the color if you want to, or I'm just going to make it white for now, and I'm going to say create. And here's our new project. Now, over here on the right-hand side, remember, a lot of this is very similar to Illustrator. We have our layers menu over here. If you don't see your layers menu under the window drop-down, sorry, my computer's lagging here a little bit. Anything that has the check mark by it is what you are able to see over here on the right-hand side. Remember also that these tabs are sort of tear and drag tabs, so you can combine different things together if you want to, which is okay. But here's our layer. So background is white. If I want to change the entire color of my background, it's very easy to do so. I'm going to leave this background white for whatever reason. I guess I'm just superstitious. Down here at the bottom, I have this button that creates a new layer. So I can see this little guy right here next to the garbage can. I'm going to create a new layer. If I click on that layer a couple times, it turns blue so I can label it. So I'm going to call this, I'm just going to call it color ground. I know you guys can't read it from out there, but just as color ground, right? Just like that. Labeling your layers is important. When you start with your project, you're probably only going to have a couple of layers, but when you work with this program a lot and you have like 60 layers, it just saves so much time to label what you have. So it's a good habit to get into. All right, to put one whole color in one empty space, like one huge empty space like this, we're going to use our paint bucket tool. So that paint bucket tool, if you don't see it, it's underneath the gradient tool. So we see this gradient tool right here has a little triangle next to the corner. If I hold down on it, it gives me some choices. I'm going to choose the paint bucket. And what the paint bucket does is it allows me to fill. So right now, if you remember down here in the corner, this black and white, in Illustrator, this black represented the fill color and the white represented the stroke or the outline color. In Photoshop, this front bin up here on the left is the foreground color, and then this is your background color. So foreground color is pretty much every color you're ever going to use, painting, filling, drawing, whatever. Background is just if you're using the eraser or cutting things out. All right, so if I were to tap this color ground layer right now, it would turn the whole thing black. If I want to change the color, again, I just double click on this little square, which we've done in Illustrator before, and I choose a better color. So I'm going to choose blue. Now, you also might remember as you're choosing your colors for this assignment, remember we have some color scheme websites we can go to. One is that Kuler site, Kuler, Adobe's website where you could match up different colors. Maybe I'll talk about that in a little bit. I don't want to get into that in this part of the video, but I'll put a separate video in for that. But for now, let's just grab a color here. So I'm going to choose this color here. I'm going to say OK. I'm tapping it again, and I'm filling the color. And you can see in my layer preview is also changing a color. So it all sort of makes sense over there. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to learn how to make a shape, right? So let's make a new layer. So again, I'm going to put everything on a separate layer. So I'm going to go down to this button again next to the garbage can. I made a new layer. I'm going to call this layer, double clicking over here. I'm going to call this square, like so. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, and we've learned some of these tools already, but I'm going to use this tool, which is called the marquee tool. This is a rectangular marquee tool specifically. If I hold down on it, I see there's some other selections under here. I'm going to start with the rectangle, and I'm going to draw a selection. Now, by default, depending on what version of Photoshop you're using, it may lock into a square. If not, I can draw a rectangle here of any shape. If I hold down my Shift key, then it constrains it to a perfect square. Okay, so let's just I'm going to make a square just like so. And I let go, and there's my square. So now if I use my paint bucket, so let's choose another blue color here. Let's just make it slightly darker. if I use this paint bucket and I fill this layer and I fill inside this shape, or actually let's try to fill outside of it. I'm tapping my mouse and nothing is happening. If I tap inside the square, suddenly it changes only the color that is selected inside that square. And I can see here that it's on its own layer, it's that little square, and then my background is on its own layer too, right? Now, if I want to move this over, I can use the marquee tool again, and I can grab this box, and I can scooch it down here, go back to my paint bucket, fill that shape, go back to my marquee tool, over here, push it over here, let's drop it right there, use my paint bucket, fill that shape, marquee tool, fill that shape. All right, so that's one way to just make some shapes. Like if you had rhythm or texture or something and you wanted to put squares right next to each other. If you want to line these up, a shortcut is if you hold the Command key on your keyboard and tap the apostrophe, which is next to the return key, you can get a grid. Right? And the nice thing about that grid is that if you use this transform tool now, I can move these squares around so that they fit perfectly into that grid situation there. Right? Oh, and I have to go select. I'm going to say deselect, like so. But now the difficulty with this is if I grab this layer, see I'm grabbing the whole layer and I'm moving it around. This is the thing that's a little bit annoying, that like in Illustrator, you actually have individual shapes that are on the layer, and when you click on the shape, it moves the shape. In Photoshop, it does not. It sees everything on this layer as one bitmapped picture, like as one series of pixels. So if I move one pixel, it moves them all. So if I want to move just this box separately, I need to reselect it like this. All the time making sure I'm on the right layer, so I'm on square layer. Then if I use the transforming tool, I can grab this one square. All right, so it's a little bit of a pain. And yes, for this assignment, we're using it to learn how to use the Photoshop controls to build these shapes and move things around. It's more of like an exercise. But honestly, if you are doing like geometric shapes and colors and things like that, Illustrator is by far the better program to use for this sort of thing. But anyways, I digress. We're just sort of learning. So again, if I want to move another shape, I have to go select, deselect, or Command D. Then I use my selecting tool again, and I select this square again, making sure I'm on the right layer. I use the transforming tool, and I move this guy around just a little bit. I can also shrink this square, like if I want to make it fit inside the grid. I can do that, hit the check mark when I'm done, and it's all set to go. All right, so that's like basic transformations. If I want to make circles instead of squares, I can go to the elliptical marquee tool. I'll make a new layer. I'm going to double click on where it says layer 1. I'm going to call it circles. And then I'm going to draw a circle. And if I want a perfect circle, I hold down the shift key again for this. And then I can move it around like so. All right, but now phase 2 is this. All right, this is a selecting tool. So right now I can just make a circle, right? If I want to add to this circle, let's say I want to make like a Mickey Mouse shape in here. I use my circle tool, and up here at the top, you'll see I have these different selections here. So I have this plain square. I have two squares together, which is the add selection. I have the subtract selection, and then I have the intersect. These other two are going to be pretty important. So I'm going to go to add selection right now. And when I make a circle like this, shift, and I pull, it's going to add another ear to my Mickey Mouse here, like so. So see how I made that connection? I hold down my shift on this side, and I pull it this way. I got another circle, sort of off-kiltered ears there. Let's say I want to take this bottom part out of my circle. I go to the subtract one up here at the top, which is this third one over. And I draw my shape underneath, like this. And I let go. Suddenly it takes that piece out of the center, just like so. All right, so I can keep adding. So that way, I have my shape like so. Now I'm going to use my paint bucket again, and let's fill this with, let's make another blue here. Let's make a very light, frosty blue. There we go. I'm going to use my paint bucket, and I'm going to fill. And see the way it filled in both? It saw both of those shapes as one continuous sort of a shape there. Then I use my moving tool here, and I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to put it right, I don't know, this, right there. I don't know what kind of balance I'm creating here. So again, I can see my layers growing. I see my shapes growing. Now, let's say you want to do something a little bit different. You can use another selecting tool. So this is just a regular shape, square or circle. Underneath here, I have this thing called the lasso tool. And if I hold down on it, I see that I have different types of lassos. One is the freehand lasso. it has the same controllers here. So if I want to add to my selection up here, and I draw like this, let's try to snap to the grid there, like that. So I've just added to my selection, like I can connect these two down here, like so. Now if I hit the fill bucket here, fills that all together. I can use, here, let me get rid of this grid. So Command apostrophe gets rid of the grid. Let's smooth that out a little bit. Oops. Just like so. There's a much smoother line without that grid. That, I'm going to fill it again. There we go. I can use the polygon lasso tool, which is kind of handy. What that does is, let's use subtraction here, and I can go, I click with my mouse and then move and click, 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 move and click. And then when I come over here, you can see, let's see if we can see closer. So right now there's a little minus symbol next to my tool, and if I go here, you can see that it turns into a circle and it closes the gap. So now I'm going to subtract all that space that's inside of here. So now what I'll do is if I fill this, let's fill it with another color. Let's fill it with this dark color. Now it's only filling the part that's selected, and it took that part out of the selection, right? So adding to your selection is this button here. Taking away from your selection is this button. And you can experiment with the intersect one. That's just when the two lines intersect. That's all you're left with. Again, there's appropriate times to use that, but it's just a little bit confusing. So, mess around. All right, so again, select. I'm going to say deselect. Then the last thing you can use down here for now is these selecting tools. This is called the quick selection and the magic wand. And these select areas based on their color. So quick selection, if I use that, it's like a paintbrush. And I paint in, oops, hang on, deselect. Make sure you're on the right layer. Oh, I am. I'm on circles layer. I'm going to paint this in. So you can see it's just sort of grabbing some different colors here. Right, it's grabbing everything that's blue. Or I can use, Command D is deselect. I can use the magic wand tool, and the magic wand selects everything that is that blue color, right? Or I can come down here to my square layer, and I can add that to my layer. I can add this. I have my add here. I can add subtract. Go back to my circles layer and remove that from my selection. Go back to my squares. Go to plus, and add those selections in there like that. Or maybe let's go to subtract again, and I get rid of these two, and maybe I want these other two blues to be a different color, so I go here. And I say OK, and I say paint bucket, and I fill this with a different blue, and I fill that with a different blue. So the thing about Photoshop that is also different than Illustrator, one thing to keep in mind the whole time, is that just like in Illustrator you had to use the selection tool to highlight it first, and then you could change it, in Photoshop you have to select it first with some sort of a selecting tool before you make your change to it. All right, so that's basically the beginnings of how you work this. So let's get rid of this circles here. It's sort of ugly. So let's put some rectangles in here. So a couple tricks you could do, so let's say you were doing repetition, right? I'm going to go Command apostrophe and bring my grid back. I'm going to use my marquee tool. I'm going to check under view here, and it says snap. So that means that my marquee tool is naturally going to snap to that grid. If I don't want to do that, I can turn that off. And then here, this is telling me everything that it's snapping to. So now I'm going to draw a square like this. All right, it's going to naturally snap to that. I'm going to choose a different color. So let's choose, I like this orange is good. I'm going to fill this in like so. Oops, undo. Sorry, I didn't make my new layer. Haste makes waste. New layer. Let's call this bars. And I filled them, right? So you can see when I was on the wrong layer, here, let's just do that for example. When I was on the square layer and I hit fill, it only filled in this available space between those squares within my selection, right? Because that section was empty, so you can see it kind of filled that in. But what I'm going to do is I really want it to be on this bars layer here. So this is important over here, just like an Illustrator. You want to make sure you're selecting the right layer. So I'm on my bars here, and I'm going to fill this up, right? I'm going to take my moving tool, and you can't move it when it's adding. You can only move it when it's the single redo here. I'm going to move this over here. I'm going to say fill. I'm going to fill it. Oops, it wasn't high enough. Hold on. A little higher. There we go. Fill orange. Right, but then what I can do is I can take my selecting tool and I can select both of these like this, and I can say edit copy, edit paste. There we go, use my moving tool. And I'm going to drag those two guys here like that. And then I'm going to say edit, and I'm going to say paste again. And I'm going to move these guys over here. So again, one thing you're hopefully learning from all of these programs and using anything like this, cutting and pasting is your friend, right? Making copies of things, moving things over. These three layers are all their own layers now. You can see every time I cut and paste, I make a new layer. But if I hold down my Shift key and select all three of those layers, I can use this little drop down up here, and I can say, is there a merge selected here? I can say merge layers. There we go, and it merged these three layers together. So now all these stripes are on one layer. I can right-click on here and make a duplicate layer. Oh, shoot. Always delete, not duplicate. Duplicate layer, there we go. Say yes. There we go. So here's my second layer. This is the second layer of these guys here. I can use my paint bucket. Actually, let's change the orange here a little bit. Let's make it a little brighter. I'm going to use my paint bucket, and I'm going to fill in all these guys here in the middle. All right, so those are all those orange ones in the middle. So there you go. So you're going to start putting things together. You're going to start measuring things out. Again, using a different background color, changing that up however you want to do it. Separate layers is definitely the key, right? Because if you have things separated by layers, then it's a lot easier to change things and to color things. Text is the same we learned before. If you want to use the T here, I click on the T and I start to type. This is a test. All right, the type is really tiny down here, so I can grab the corner of it. All right, and I'm going to stretch it out. And if you have upgraded to Photoshop 2019, you no longer have to hold the Shift key when you're adjusting text. It will stay in perspective. Here's my test words here. Let's move it down a little bit. And I'm going to hit the check mark. There we go. I'm going to say Command apostrophe and turn off those lines. And then finally, if you want to add some texture to some of your shapes, you can do it just like you did the text. So if I double click in the gray area of my text, I'm right over here, right in this gray area. I can add a drop shadow, which I always love, right? So I can see right there. This is without the drop shadow. With the drop shadow, looks great. I could also take one of my layers here, like this brown layer, double click on the gray area, and let's say bevel and emboss and see what it does. There we go. So it gives it sort of an interesting edge to it. You could try inner glow. You could try color overlay. You could try all sorts of different stuff on here. Outer glow. I'm going to go back to bevel and emboss. And then we try the drop shadow and what it looks like. Yeah, drop shadow is kind of interesting on that one too. There we go. So it made the shapes look very textural. And remember, if you don't see these transform controls on the outside, that's just this button up here. So I can hide those temporarily to take a look, and I can turn them back on that way. So there you go. So all you do, again, the programs are fun and interesting, but really good composition comes from good balance, good rhythm, things that you're explaining on these posters. So there you go. When you are all done, same thing as Illustrator, you're going to say Save As. Instead of exporting it, right now when you have a Photoshop document, you save it as a Photoshop document. Let's call this test. I'm going to save it on my desktop, and I'm going to say Save. When I save this on my desktop, sorry, I cleared some of my junk here. You can see here it says test.psd. That PSD means Photoshop document. When I double click that to open it up, it means that it's preserving all of the layers that I have here in this layer menu. If I say Save As, and I change this to a JPEG, this is what you're going to want to save it to before you turn it in. I'm going to say Save. Here I'm going to save it as a large file so that it has some good resolution to it. I minimize this. Now I can see over here I have a Photoshop document and I have a test JPEG document. The Photoshop document is obviously going to be a larger file because it has more information in it. The JPEG is good for posting on your websites or for the homework assignment and all that other good stuff. All right, so there you have it. Good luck, happy drawing.